Hey guys, I'm back with another video, and this is going to be our continuation of our Blazing blog app which we are building using Blazor server. So this is the part 4. Before continuing on this one, I would recommend you to check out the all three previous parts. I'm going to drop the links of all those three parts in the description box, so please do check those out. So let's start. So in previous video, we worked on login page, this login page UI. We show the basic functionality that we can click on login, and if the login was success, we added this uh, artificial delay, manual delay of 5 seconds. So if it was after this, it should navigate to the main home page, and if there was some error, it should simply show the error message on the UI. So that's all we have achieved in the previous part. And in this part, we are going to work on the, I think, most important part of this application, that authentication basically. So for that, let's start. So first thing we need to, let's create a new folder for services. Services. Here we'll have all the services which we are going to have. So first thing we need to have a, let's say, user service. Let's create it, create a class, and we'll say user service. And in here we have our database context, so we will inject that. What was the name of our context again? Block context. So block context. Let's create a global import file. Class global using, and let's use that global using blazing blog dot models dot services dot data dot entities, and I think we are good now. So block context fine. Now here we'll have one method, public async task, which is login async, and here we'll have our username and password. So let's check on our login page. We had this login model, so we'll use this only. So instead of having this, let's have a login model directly, and let's call it model only. And now we'll use this. So db user await db context dot users dot as no tracking, because we are not tracking the changes, because we are not going to modify something here. We simply need the read from database only, so there is no point of adding tracking behavior here. Then we'll use where, so u goes to u dot, we are using email for the login as username, model dot username. And for now I am not using the password, but we'll do it later. So if you remember, in our entity of user we had the salt and hash, so we are actually going to implement hashing for login. So that's why for now I'm just having simple check with email only, not with password, because I have added this dummy salt and hash. Okay, so after this we should be having this first or default, or let's use this here only. So we have DB user here. Now we'll check if this DB user is not null, that means login success. Okay, and if that's not the case, then login failed. Fine. So if the login is successful, we will return something from here. And that model, let's create that model in models only. And we are going to use that model for our authentication purpose on the Blazor side as well. For now, we just need, let's create it as a record struct, and this is going to be logged in user. And here we need user ID and a display name. We need only these two things. But in a bigger application, you might need to have role as well and maybe some other details, that avatar image and all other things, so you can modify it as per your requirement. But for me, this is fine. Logged in user with user ID and display name. That should work in our case. So let's go to our user service, and here we'll return this, return new logged in user, and we'll get user ID from our DB user, and then DB user dot our display name. So let's get the display name. Display name should be first name space last name, but last name is actually optional, nullable. So we'll do something like this: DB user dot first name, then space last name, and then we'll apply trim here. So if we have given both of these, first name and last name, then it will have no effect. And if the last name is null, in that case it should be first name space then nothing then dot trim. So trim is going to trim out the space, so this will simply have first name. Okay, so this is fine. And if that's not the case, okay, let's return this. And if that's not the case, if login failed, we'll simply return, let's say, null from here. And let's add nullable here. And now we should be good. So login async, we are getting this. Now next thing is, if we really want to use this login functionality, we can directly use this on our login page, but that way we won't have that authentication properly set up. So now we are going to see how can we set up the authentication state and all those things in Blazor. So for that, let me create a new folder and let's call it authentication. And here we'll create a class, let's say authentication service. Okay. And for this authentication service, we'll inject the user service here. We'll use this user service. And here again, we'll have class. So we'll have a method for login. So let's say public async task logged in user. And let's say get user async. And here we'll have our login model. Okay. Now we'll access the logged in user. Logged in user. equals, it will be await user service dot login async and then login model. Now we have two things. Either this logged in user will be null or it will have a value if the credentials were correct. In this case, if the username was correct, right? So for now, let's return this only logged in user and let's make it nullable here. We'll fix it later. Now we need our custom authentication state provider. So by default, Blazor gives us authentication state provider, but it's recommended to create a subclass of that and then use that. So we'll use it, let's say blog authentication state provider. And this should be derived from authentication state provider. Authentication state provider. Fine. And we need to implement it. And we have this one method get authentication state async. Here in this class, we will inject our authentication state. Not authentication state, authentication service. Authentication service. And so we have authentication service here. Now inside this get authentication state async, we need to get the authentication state. We need to provide a way by which we can get the authentication state. So here we'll access the user and we'll say await authentication service dot. Now we need this user get user async, but the problem here is it requires login model, that login username and password, but we don't have this here, right? So this get authentication state async, it should have some automatic mechanism. So how this is going to work? Blazor is going to call this method whenever it is trying to check the current authentication state. It might be automatic, some periodic, some whenever we are simply the component is re-rendering, or maybe we are switching from navigating from one page to another. So this thing is going to be called multiple times from server and from client, both the sides. So if you know Blazor server, first it renders things on the server, then it returns, then it generates the connection, the signal or connection, then logic happens. The most of the work happens on the server side only, and we pass the output to the client using the signal arm. So it can work on both the sides. Now the only way we are going to use a persistent state for this, because let's say I log in, then I simply refresh the page. So there is no point of logging the user again if he already logged in, right? So we should have a mechanism when user logs in, it should save the state somewhere, and in this case it should be on client side, on browser side only. So if I refresh the page, it can get the state from the browser and then it can check if the user is logged in or not. So for that we need to somehow store the state on the client side. So we'll go to our authentication service again, and here we'll use a service which is protected local storage. Protected local storage. So local storage is the browser's local storage. We don't need session storage because we want it to be persisted. Then protected, it is a kind of wrapper which stores the data in an encrypted format. So data will not be in direct. So if you know how browser's local storage works, it simply has plain key value pair of data. But protected local storage, it is going to encrypt that data. Okay, so let's use this, create and assign, and we are good. We have protected local storage. Here we need to have, let's say, helper methods to set the user to the local storage, get the user from the local storage, and remove the user from here, right? So let's have these methods: public, async, task. Let's say first thing we need to save it. So save user to, let's say, storage, or let's say save user to browser storage. Okay, save user to browser storage, and the user is going to be logged in user. Now we need to have some common key. So for that, let me have a private const string here, and let's say user storage key. User storage key. It can be anything. Let's say blog user. We can have it whatever we want. And in this set user to browser storage, now we'll use our protected local storage dot set async, and we should be good. So set async, user storage key, and then user. Next thing, we need to have this because this local storage, it cannot have complex objects, it can have simple strings. So we need to serialize this value so that when we are trying to fetch the data from storage, we should be able to deserialize it. So for that, let's have a private serializer settings here. JSON serializer options. We'll have the default JSON serializer options. Let's have default only. We don't need to have. I am having it as a separate variable instead of directly using it here. JSON serializer dot serialize. So first is object value, which is this thing, and I'm not using any these JSON serializer options insert directly here because we need to have the same options when serializing and deserializing. So it's better to have it common at a centralized place so that we can use it from both the places. And now we should be good. We have set it to the database, not database, the browser storage. Fine. Next thing is we need to read from here, right? So let's say public async task, and we'll read it and return the actual object that is logged in user. So let's call it read from browser storage. Browser storage. Okay. And we don't need any parameter here. So here, first thing, we'll have, let's say, the result, or let's say data, storage data. So we'll use await protected local storage dot get item, that's get async, and it will always give us string because we have serialized the data. It requires a key, so we are going to use this key only. Now if we look into get async, it gives us protected browser storage result, and if we check this struct, it has success and value, these two properties. So success indicates whether the operation was successful or not. So we need to check if the result was successful or not. So let's say storage result, or let's have call it result only. So we'll check here if result dot success. If we If the operation was successful, then we'll do our thing. And in addition to this, let's have one more check here. We'll check if we actually got the data. So success indicates the operation was success if the data is actually there. So result dot data, which is result dot value, which is string in this case. So we are checking if the value actually exists, that is not null or not white space, right? Now we checked it. Next thing is we need to get actual logged in user here. So for that, we know we have this result dot value, but this is a string. So we have serialized it. Now we need to deserialize it. So we'll use the same JSON serializer dot deserialize, and here, cool, logged in user result dot value, and it's better to pass this JSON serializer options. So if we want to somehow add anything here, let's say we want to have it indented, or maybe we have to um, use some different casing for any purpose. So it's better to, in that case, we'll simply have to add the settings at one place only, and it will be reflected in serializing and deserializing for both the use cases. Okay, fine. So we have logged in user now. Now we can simply return it. Now, what if we could not get it? In that case, we'll simply return null. So it should be nullable. Now, here is one problem. And the problem is, as I already mentioned, this thing, all these things can be called from server and from client, both the places. But if this thing is getting called from the server, there this protected local storage does not exist because there is no browser on the server side, right? That is simply ASP.NET Core runtime. So we can get something from memory, but we don't have browser. So how it works, it will first try to get the value at server side, then it will again access it from the browser. So if it is accessing it from server side, we need to handle that case. So in that case, it simply throws an exception, that is invalid operation exception. EX. So we don't need this exception because we know that this is going to be from server side only. So let me simply, let's say, it out this exception. As we know, this will occur when this method is being called from server where there is no browser and local storage. And we can add notes here that don't worry about this, as this will be called from client side, a browser side as well. Browsers after this. So we will have the data there. So we are good. So we are good to ignore this. Fine. Okay, and now we have all this thing in place. Next thing is, we have saved the user, we have read from the user. Now let's have one more. For logout case, we need to remove the user from the local storage. So public async task, let's say remove from browser storage. Fine. So await, and we don't need any specific key because this is going to be per user basis. So we can directly remove that. So we have the protected local storage, that something delete async, and here we just need to pass the key. Now we are good with our local storage setup. So data persistent is fine. Now we need to, where is save? Yeah, we need to save the user when we are logging, right? When the user is logging, at that time it should save to the browser storage, right? So here in logged in user, let's say logged in user is not null. If it is not null, we simply are going to save user to browser storage, and here we just need to pass our logged in user, this object. And what is the issue? Okay, nullable. So we need to pass logged in user dot value. So now when user is logging, we logging into the system, then we'll first try to log in. If the user, we found the user was successfully logged in, then we'll simply save that value to the browser storage so that we can refetch it. Fine. Now we are good here. Let's go back to our authentication state provider. Now instead of this authentication service.get user async, what we are going to do, we are going to get the user from the browsers, right? So read. Let's change it to get only. That would make more sense, right? So to authentication state again, and instead of read from browser storage, let's rename it to use get user from browser storage async. Yeah, save user to browser storage async, this is also an async method, and remove user from browser storage async. Remove user from browser storage async. Yeah, now we are good. So let's go here, and now we'll use our method get user from browser storage async. Now we need to check if we got the user, if user is not null. That means user is already logged in and we have the user's state in our browser's local storage. So we can use this user directly from here. And in order to do this, we have authentication state, and if we check it, this authentication state requires a claims principal. So let's create the claims principal here. Claims principal equals new claims principal. Cool. Now we'll simply have this claim principal here, like so we'll say claims principal, it requires an identity. So first let's create the identity, where identity equals new claims identity, and in this claims identity we can give list of claims. So we are going to use this. So let's have a new array, and the claims we need to have two claims. So first claim is, because we know in our user, this logged in user, it has two things, ID and display name. So we are going to set these two things. So first let's set ID, and ID we'll save it under claim types dot name identifier. That is the unique identifier for this. So we have user dot user ID, or what is this, user dot value dot user ID. dot toString. And the next claim we need, that is name, which is display name. So which is already string, so we don't need to convert it to string. And our claims identity is ready. And after this, we have authentication type as well. So it's always better to have the separate, the specific authentication type to avoid clashes. So we'll have a private const here, private const string, let's say blog authentication type. And we'll say, let's say blog auth. We can name it whatever we want. So let's use this as a second parameter here. Fine. Now we need to use this identity to fill the claims principal. So for that, we'll simply use claims principal. Let's pre-initialize it. New claims principal with, we have this I identity, right? So we can use this identity directly here. We can do this. Now we set the claim principal, but what if user was null? User was not logged in, maybe. So in this case, we'll have default value, which we already have, right? So I don't think we need this else case in that case. So we can simply return authentication state from here with claims principal. So this thing, get authentication state async, is done for us. Now next thing is, what if this state changes? So state changes means when we log in at that time it will change, and when we log out at that time it will change. So we need to somehow have the mechanisms to notify the subscribers of this, in this case the Blazor's authentication, that cascading authentication state provider and all this, to know that authentication state has changed. So, but before that, let's have a property here for which property, let's say of type logged in user. So we'll call it logged in user only, logged in user, so that we can directly access this logged in user. So it will have our user ID and display name, so we can directly access this, that we'll use. Now let's have it, the setter to be private, and let's have a default value, user ID, let's say 0, and display name string.empty. And yes. Now next thing is, in this based authentication state provider, we have an event which is authentication state change handler, authentication state changed. So an event that provides notification when the authentication state has changed, right? For example, this event may be raised if a user logs in or logs out. So we need to use this event to notify our users and to modify the, where is notify or modify this logged in user. So when user is logging in, then we'll add the current logged in user to this variable, this property, and when user is logging out, we'll simply clear this out with this default value, you could say. Fine. So for this, let's access that. So that was authentication state changed event, right? So we'll add a event handler for this, private void this one, and we have this task of authentication state task. How we can get the user? we can simply await it. So we'll say where authentication state, or let's say auth state equals await task. So how this is going to work? This will simply call this method. And from here, if the user is logged in, that means we have the user's data in browser storage. So it will simply come here and it will return it, the claims principal, and that we'll have in authenticate or this auth state variable here. Now, first thing we need to check if auth state is null, is not null. If it's not null, then now we don't need this. If it is null, then we will not do anything, and if it is not null, then we'll simply use our logged in user and we'll fill the value from here. So if we'll check auth state dot, we have this user property here, and this user is of type claims principal. So we need to get our logged in user object from these claims principles. So we know when we are creating the claims principal, we used these two claim types basically. So when we are reading the data out from it, we'll again use the same thing, right? So before setting it, let's say so we'll say, let's say user ID, we'll get it from auth state dot user dot. We have two approaches here. Because we have used name identifier and name, we can, I think, get, or let's say do the thing by which we can simply find first value, and then we can simply add our claim types. So this user ID, we need this as integer. So convert dot toInt, this find first value, it returns string, so we don't need the string. Okay, now next thing, after user ID we need display name, so that we can get using auth state user find first value, and here we'll use name this time because we have used this name when we set the value. Cool. And this should be display name. And now we can generate our logged in user using these two values, right? So we can say our logged in user, this property equals new logged in user ID and display name. We can omit this, and this is nullable, but we know we'll have value in this, so we can use this thing. Okay, fine. Did we miss something? I don't think so. Cool. Now we have attached this event handler in our constructor. So whenever we are attaching any event handler, so it's always a good approach to remove that event handler to avoid memory leaks. So we'll simply implement iDisposable and we'll add the dispose method here. And in this dispose method, we'll simply do the opposite of this. Here we are adding the event handler, and in dispose we'll simply remove this event handler. So now everything looks like everything is in place in this class. Fine, now I think we are good to use it. Let's try. But before that, let's add the logout functionality as well. Did we add login to this? So from our thing, we'll go to authentication state and we'll use get user is saying. Okay, let's go step by step. So next thing, we need to go to our login page. So go to pages, login.razor. And now here, but okay, I missed one thing. We need to inject this authentication service. So we need to register it in our program.cs. So we need to register all these three services we have created. First, we created our user service. So we'll say builder.services.add transient is okay for user service. User service. I have not added interface, but if you want to introduce unit test to mock this, you can add an interface and then you can register iUser service, comma user service. But for now, I'm using simply this user service. Next thing, I need to register builder.services. I need to register our authentication service and it should be scoped, because we need to have the same instance throughout the request lifecycle, right? So throughout the multiple, or we could say Blazor server uses the same scope when dealing with all the signal or incoming and outgoing requests. So we'll use the same instance. So we can use authentication service, right? Authentication service. What is the issue? Authentication service, right? Authentication service. Okay, let's use it to global usings. Authentication service, fine. Now the most important part, by default, Blazor uses this authentication state provider. Now we are saying that if we are modifying the Blazor's default functionality, that if it try to access this authentication state provider, will give it this block authentication state provider service. So we'll give this service because our logic for logging in, for log out, we'll add it, and to get the currently logged in user, all these things are in our blog authentication state provider. Those does not exist in authentication state provider. So we'll do this. But before that, we will access this blog authentication state provider explicitly. So for that also we can register it. Then next, we need to register authentication state provider, and for authentication state provider, we need to pass the same instance we have from blog authentication state provider explicitly registered thing, right? So for that, if we check when we are registering a service, we have this func delegate, so it gets in the ICE service provider and it will return authentication state provider, that is this one. So what we can do, we will use this service provider and from this service provider we'll simply return service provider dot get required service blog authentication state provider. So we have registered this as scoped, then we are trying to register authentication state provider which Blazor is going to use, and if it will try to inject this, we'll actually provide the same instance of blog authentication state provider which we registered earlier, right? So we are getting it from the registered services. So this is all in place. Now let's go to the login.razor page, and on this login.razor page we'll simply use this. Where is our login.razor? Here it is. Cool. So when we clicked on this login async method, when we are dealing with this one, but okay, I missed one thing. When we are using authentication state provider, so we should go to app.razor, and here we'll add all this inside cascading authentication state so that it can pass the complete authentication state to each and every page and component, and it can actually react to changes in different uh, pages, so we can get all those running. Okay, on login we'll simply first, let's save it, go to login.razor page. Now in this login async method we need to use our authenticate state provider and authenticate state service, all those things. So let's first inject those. So inject blog authentication state provider, and let's call it blog auth provider, blog auth state provider. Cool. And now we'll come here when we are trying to log in. So we'll remove this. Now we don't need this one. Now we need to allow user to log in. So let's use blog auth state provider dot. We have logged in property, get authentication state, and we don't have anything else, right? Okay, so we can get it from our authentication service, but it's better to have authentication service separate, and we'll use authentication service from blog authentication state provider only. So in this blog authentication state provider, let's add a method to allow user to log in. So we'll say public async task logged in user null label, let's say login async, and it will expect a login model, and from here we'll simply return the result from authenticate state provider dot get user async, this one. So how this get user async works, it simply goes here, it's tried to login. Okay, this name does not make sense. Now we are just not just getting, we are allowing user to login, right? So it should change to login user async. Cool, because we are getting the data, then we are saving it to browser storage, then we are returning it. So it should have this login user async name. So authentication state service dot login user async login model, fine, and it will return nullable logged in user to the caller basically. And in this case, the caller is our login.razor page here. So we can have logged in user, not logged in user, login async, and then we can provide the this model here, underscore model. Cool. And from this we will get our logged in user object, and let me await it. Fine. Now we have two things, either this logged in user will have a value or it will not have a value. So if we got some value, logged in user is not null, that means login was successful. If that was not the case, that means there was some error in the credentials. So we already have our underscore error variable here. So in else part we'll say error equals, let's say, invalid credentials. Invalid credentials. Cool. If user was login successfully, in that case, in that case we need to set it. Okay, first thing after this we need to set is processing to false, and we need this navigate to here. If user was successfully logged in, then only we'll navigate the user. Or let's change this behavior from login async, because to get the user here we should use authentication state provider only to get the current logged in user. So let's go here login async, and that if and else check, let's have it here. So this if and else, right? So what we will do it like this. So we'll have it logged in user, we'll access it here, and then we'll add this if and else if logged in user. So instead of returning this logged in user, we'll simply return string from here, which will be the error message if we got any error message. So let's negate this. If logged in user is null, that means we could not get the user. Credentials were incorrect. So we'll return invalid credentials from here, and we'll return simply null from outside. So okay, so now login async is trying to log in, and if it was able to log in, it will return null, and if it was not able to log in, so that means in our case the credentials were incorrect, so it will return this. So let's go to the caller. Here instead of logged in user, we can say the underscore error directly. Cool. So if we got some error, then only it will set. If login was not successful, it will have that error message, and if it was successful, it will have null, right? So we don't want to show the uh, error in that case. Cool. Now we'll check if this underscore error, if it had some value, if the string dot, if it is not null, it had some value, that means we got this some error. So we'll simply set is processing to false in this case, right? And we'll not do anything. If this was not the case, then we came to else part, and in else part we first need to get the user. And now here's the part, we'll get that user from where logged in user. We'll get this logged in user from this blog auth state provider dot logged in user, this property. So if we got this data from this logged in user is always had some value, right? So it has this default value. Okay, let's modify this read only struct, and here we can have a method public bool, let's say is empty, and it will be if the user ID is 0, or let's say it will be 0 the default value. If this is the case, then we'll return this is empty to true. This saying make member read only. Okay, it was actually read only. We can have read only properties directly. Okay. So we'll use this thing here. We got this logged in user. Now we'll check if logged in user dot is empty. If this is empty, that means somehow this request was not successful, but our logic, it was not able to uh, fetch the error. So if this is the case, we'll again use underscore error to set the thing that could not log in. It's very rare edge case, but still I'm adding it. So you can say please try again, and again we'll set is processing to false in this case also. If it is not empty, that means login was successful, we were able to get the logged in user details, and it was not empty, that means it had the user ID. If this was the case, so it indicates successful login. If this is the case, then we'll simply redirect the user to home page. Now let's remove this thing. So it's a lot of coding, and finally we got it, and now it should work as expected. Only one thing is, let's see if it is actually working after setting it. Let's go to our top nav bar, and there the last ally, let's on this login, like right from here, let's add an authorized view. So how this authorized view works, we can have different states in this. So first we have authorized, then we have authorizing, and then third, let's move it to the top, then we have third one, which is not authorized. So it uses the this cascading authentic state, which in turn uses the authentication state provider, which uses where is our this authentication state provider, and which will use this blog authentication state provider because we have set it. And from this blog authentication state provider, it is going to use this get authentication state async, and it will return the current logged in user or blank identity, right? So this is how this complete flow is going to work. So when it is trying to get the authentication state, this authorizing, it will run this template, it will skip these two, it will not render these two, it will simply run this. So let's have a default text here, let's say checking auth state. If user was authorized, we need to show the currently logged in user name. And how we can do this? This authorized view, it gives us a variable, a context variable by which we can access everything. So that is context dot then this user. This is claims principal user. It gives us the things. From this we can get the identity dot, then we can get this name. We can use this thing. Now this user could be null. So let's say this and this. Although it is a rare case, but still it's good to have it. So now we have this authorized and this. First thing, it will render checking auth state. Then if it got it successful and if the user was logged in, it will simply show the user's name. And if the user was not authorized, then it will render this not authorized. So in our case, we will display this nav link inside not authorized. So we are going to show login link only if the user is not logged in. And if the user was logged in, we'll show user's name and we'll display the logout button as well. So let's have two of these. In first one, we'll say this, and we are not doing anything, and we'll use btn, let's say btn lite, and it should be disabled because on clicking on the name, we are not going to redirect user to anywhere. And because we are not doing anything inside href, we will simply say javascript void, like don't do anything basically. Cool. So and this should be logout and href, not href, let's have a button here, button type button with some classes, let's say btn primary, and it will be logout. We'll add our logout function. Okay, now let's check if all of these things are working or not. Enough coding, let's see all this in action. But all this was actually very important aspect because authentication and authorization, this is a crucial part of every application. So we should have, let's refresh. Okay, it is very fast. Let's try to log in. We are at login. If we don't do anything, it will simply say all of these things are required. Let me add the wrong email and password. We are not checking. It could be good. Login, logging in, and invalid credentials. So this thing is working. Now if we provide the correct credential, in our case this username only, and if we say login, could not log in, please try again, that means there is something missing. But what is it? Let me check. Let me add the uh, breakpoint. So when we are clicking on this, it should come here, login model, then it should go to authentication state here, and after this it should call that authentication state changed event handler, and from here it should use this get authentication state async. Cool. Let's see. In we came to authenticate state providers login method. We had the data, tool, username and password. Fine. We came here, authentication service. We went to authentication service and we got the data. Logged in user is not null. We went to save it to the session storage, local storage. Cool. We had logged in users data here, 1 and Abhay prints and is empty false. Then after this, we went here, logged in user is null. No, it is not null. So return null, that there was no error. It will come here and it will get logged in user. But the problem here is it should have called this thing, right? Authentication state change. This should have executed, but it did not. And why so? Because after login, we did not notify that we logged in, we did something. If we check the base class authentication state provider, so we have this notify authentication state change method, right? Which actually invokes this authentication state change. So we need to call this. So this is the missing piece. Let's go here. And here when we are logging in, after login, if we came here, we'll return from directly from here, we should be good. And if this is not the case, then we need to call this method from its base task of authentication state. So in this case, let's use task.from result and we'll use new authentication state object authentication state, and it needs a claims principal, and this claims principal, we have this logic somewhere, right? To get the claims principal, which is in here, right? From user, we have this thing. So it's better to migrate this code, move, extract out this code to a separate helper method. So let's do this. Claims principal, like this one. So let's cut it. Let's have a private claims principal, get claims principal from user. And here we'll use the logged in user as a parameter. Logged in user, we'll do this, and we'll simply return new claims principal. And now what is the issue here? User.value. No, we know we have user, so we can directly use this. Cool. We are returning it from here. Return. So let's use this. Okay, it can be converted into a static method. Get claims principal from user. So we'll do this here. We'll say claims principal equals get claims principal from user. In this case, we'll pass user dot value, and same thing here. Let's have where auth state equals new authentication state, and it needs the claims principal which we can get from this, and logged in user. Logged in user. This is nullable, yes. So logged in user dot value. Cool. And now we can pass this auth state here. Cool. So we are notifying this notify authentication state changed when user logged in. So we should be good. Now save it and let's run it. Page is here. For now, let's disable all the breakpoints. It should work. Let's see if it is working. Okay, we logged in actually. Let's use private window incognito mode. Let's check. So login. When we log in, if we provide the values, let's give invalid credential. Abhay prints at outlook.com 1. Invalid login. And we got invalid credentials. And if we don't have this, if we provide the correct values, then we have logged in user's name and logout. So let's quickly add this logout as well, logout functionality as well. Login async tool, we'll have our logout method here. So we'll say public async task logout async, and we don't need anything here. We'll simply say in the logout, first thing we need to remove the user from the storage, so that we can get from authentication service dot remove user from browser storage, and it is available. We remove the user from here. After that, we'll do the same thing we did here. We'll notify, and this time we will use a blank claims principal. So we'll use new claims principal without anything. So it will be empty. So we are removing the user from database. We are creating a new auth state with default with blank claims principal. Then we are notifying the change. It will come here. It will check if it is not null. It will do all these things, and everything should work out of the box. Let's call this method, this logout method, and we need to call this from here, right? From top nav bar, right? Because we have our logout method here only. So let's inject the service blog authentication state provider. So let's blog auth state provider, and let's use this. In this code block, we'll have a private async task logout async, and here we'll use await blog auth state provider dot log out async. And after logging out, we will navigate the user to the default index page. So for that, let's inject navigation manager as well. Navigation manager. For now, we can see it in action when we'll use this. When we log out the header part, it should automatically change. So let's see it in action. Logout async when we are clicking on this logout button. So let's bind this up on click. It should call this method. Logout async. Let's run it. Page is here and we say logout, and you see we see now login button. So everything is working. Let's try to log in again with the correct credentials. Our prints at outlook.com, whatever password. Oh, what happened? Okay, I need to use the type password for this. Okay, we'll do this. Logging in, there was some error. Okay, we'll check that. But after logging in, it is doing this. After log out, so we should navigate it to the index page, because what if we were on some protected page? Let's say we were on manage categories page or manage blogs page, which will be under authorized attributes. So it will show that you are not authorized, something like that. But when we are logging out, so it's better to redirect user to the home page. So let's inject this navigation manager, and after logging out, let's use navigation manager dot navigate to slash, which is the index page. Let's rerun. Is here login. Okay, but before that, let's go to login and use type password so we don't miss it. Oh, type of password. It should be type password. Okay, I missed this one. Rerun. Login. Outlook.com and some random password. Login. And we are here, and if we, let's say we are on some other page and we log out, it should log out us and redirect us to the this index page. So this functionality, this video was very long. I think this will be the longest video in this series, and it was, I think, required to finish this complete thing in one video only. So please like this video if you like this video, and share this video, subscribe my channel, and do let me know in the comment, uh, did you like this video or not, or any concern or anything, you can let me know in the comments. I'll upload the next part very soon, and in next part we will work on the manage categories section. Okay, that's all for this video. Thank you. Bye bye.